The heat was a lie, telling of lethargy when the air itself thrummed with attention only she seemed to fully register. Ilara Vance, known to the denizens of Forward Operating Base Scimitar as the quiet woman who managed the surprisingly efficient, if somewhat outdated, supply depot, moved with a grace that belied the drab, ill-fitting coveralls she wore. They called her civilian, a label offered sometimes with a dismissive shrug by fresh-faced lieutenants, sometimes with a perfunctory nod by the base commander, Colonel Marcus Thorne, civilian. The word was a cloak, heavy and shapeless, and she wore it with the same discipline she had once worn her night black insertion gear. Her age was indeterminate. Lines of experience were etched around her eyes, but her movements were those of someone decades younger, fluid and precise. She was 53, though no one here knew it, or would have believed it. Her silence was often mistaken for timidity, her efficiency for a kind of obsessive-compulsive tidiness. Few, if any, saw the coiled readiness within, the mind that catalogued every sound, every shift in the wind, every new face, and the subtle tells in their posture. The sun beat down on the corrugated iron roof of her small office, a relentless hammer. But inside, Ilara maintained an oasis of cool order. Files were perfectly aligned, tools cleaned and stored with meticulous care. This discipline was not for show. It was an extension of an inner landscape cultivated over decades of operating in environments where a misplaced item or a moment of inattention could mean the difference between life and death. Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man whose career was built on logistics and the unwavering belief in regulations, found her presence mildly irksome. He was a man of medium height, with a receding hairline he attempted to control with a severe military cut, and eyes that constantly scanned for infractions of protocol. "Ma'am?" He'd said one morning, his voice tight as he reviewed a requisition she'd flagged for redundancy, his finger tapping impatiently on the offending document. "Your diligence is noted, but perhaps stick to the tasks assigned. We have personnel for oversight." He hadn't meant it unkindly, not truly. He simply saw a woman of a certain age, out of place in the harsh, masculine environment of a desert outpost, trying too hard to be useful. He categorized her as another well-meaning but ultimately distracting civilian contractor, one more variable to manage in his tightly controlled equation of base operations. Ilara had merely nodded, her gaze steady, meeting his without challenge, but also without subservience. "Understood, Colonel." The requisition was, in fact, a duplicate that would have wasted considerable resources and, more critically, tied up transport assets needed for an upcoming operation, but she offered no further defense. The truth, she knew, rarely needed an escort. It tended to arrive on its own, often uncomfortably. She simply made a small, neat annotation on her own copy of the manifest and filed it away. Her days were a rhythm of inventory and maintenance, a quiet counterpoint to the more overt clang and bustle of military life that surrounded her. The generators, old behemoths that coughed black smoke and grumbled like dyspeptic giants, ran smoother under her watch. She didn't just replace parts when they failed. She anticipated failure. She understood the resonance of their labor, the subtle shift in tone, the almost imperceptible vibration that preceded a catastrophic breakdown. She treated the aging Perkins diesel in Generator 3 like a temperamental but valued partner, its groans and sighs a language she comprehended with an intimacy that baffled the regular maintenance crews. Young privates, sent to fetch supplies, would sometimes find her there, hands stained with grease, her expression serene, almost meditative, as she coaxed life back into the machine with a series of precise adjustments. "Miss Vance." Private Miller, a boy barely out of his teens with perpetually worried eyes and a nervous habit of chewing his lip, once asked, his voice hesitant, "How do you know what's wrong with it just by listening?" Ilara had wiped her hands on a rag, the movement economical, practiced.
"Everything talks,"
she'd said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but softened the austere lines of her face for a moment. "You just have to learn its language. This one," she patted the warm metal casing of the generator, "doesn't like to be rushed." Miller had pondered this, then nodded slowly, a seed of respect planted in the parched soil of his youthful understanding. He started listening more carefully himself, not just to machines, but to the silences between words, the unspoken currents in the air. The instructors for the pre-deployment exercises that rotated through Scimitar, hard-bitten men with faces like desert landscapes, barely registered her. They were focused on honing the skills of soldiers heading into harm's way, their attention narrowed to targets, tactics, and the brutal calculus of survival. To them, she was part of the landscape, like the sand that invaded every crevice or the prefabricated buildings that offered scant protection from the elements. During a particularly chaotic comms exercise, when the primary encrypted system went down and a stressed Captain Davies, his face flushed and his voice hoarse, was shouting at his technicians. Ilara had been refilling water coolers in the adjacent administration block. She'd heard the specific high-pitched whine from the main console just before it failed, a distinct auditory signature she recognized from a shattered comms array in a forgotten mountain pass in a country whose name was now classified years ago. Later, when the technicians were still fumbling, tracing wires and swapping modules with increasing desperation, she'd passed by the open door of the comms tent, pushing her trolley of water bottles. She'd paused, just for a second, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond the frantic voices. Then, she'd pointed to a secondary power coupling, almost hidden beneath a tangle of newly installed fiber optic cables. "Check the ground on the Series B inverter," she'd said, her voice quiet, calm, barely audible above the frustrated cursing of a young sergeant. The technician, Sergeant Rivas, a normally competent NCO now flustered and irritable, had glared at her. "What would you know about it, ma'am? This is classified gear." But Captain Davies, desperate to restore contact with the exercise controllers, had waved a hand, his patience frayed. "Check it, Sergeant! Check everything!" "I don't care if the damn cook has a suggestion, check it." Rivas, grumbling under his breath about interfering civilians, had reluctantly located the coupling and checked the ground connection. It was loose, vibrating slightly with the current. He tightened it. The system flickered, a bank of lights blinked amber, then green, and the console roared back to life with a burst of static that quickly resolved into clear communication. Davies had stared at the console, then at where Ilara had been standing, but she was already gone, pushing her water cart down the dusty track towards the mess hall, her pace unhurried. He never mentioned it directly to her, but a furrow of puzzlement had remained on his brow whenever he saw her afterward, and he found himself unconsciously lowering his voice when she was nearby, as if in the presence of an unexpected authority. Her small, sparse room in the civilian contractor block was a haven of order in the pervasive chaos of the FOB. A single worn photograph rested on the small metal desk, not of family, for she had none that knew her current life, but of a mountain range, jagged and remote, under a sky of impossibly deep, star-dusted indigo. It was a place only a handful of people on Earth knew existed. A place where she had lost something and gained something else. Sometimes, late at night, when the base was quiet except for the distant hum of the generators she tended and the lonely howl of the desert wind, she would trace the outline of a faded marking on the inside of her left wrist, usually hidden by the practical, unadorned band of her watch. It was a small, stylized nightingale, wings spread in silent flight, its form rendered in a single, unbroken line of faded blue-black ink, barely a whisper of pigment against her skin. Lark the call sign had been, in those early days, not the bird of morning, bright and heralded, but the one that sang its most intricate songs in the deepest dark, unseen, unheard by most. The insignia was from a unit that officially didn't exist, for missions that were never acknowledged. The institutional arrogance was a familiar beast, one she had encountered in many forms throughout her varied career. She'd seen it in the dismissive tones of corporate executives who underestimated her analytical skills, in the condescending smiles of academics who scoffed at her field experience, and most pointedly, in the casual disdain of military men who believed their rank or their gender or their youth gave them an inherent superiority. It no longer stung, not in the way it might have decades ago. It was simply a condition of the environment, like the grit that worked its way into everything, or the oppressive sun. The younger officers, full of fresh academy doctrine and the unearned confidence of those who had never truly been tested, were the most transparent in their condescension. Lieutenant Henderson, barely 23, with a sharp haircut and an even sharper belief in his tactical genius, often used the supply depot as an impromptu sounding board for his half-baked theories on modern warfare, addressing Ilara as if she were a piece of particularly uninteresting furniture that happened to be vaguely female. "You see, ma'am," he'd declaim, pacing before a stack of ration crates, his hands gesturing emphatically, "the key to asymmetrical warfare is proactive denial of operational space. coupled with strategic ambiguity. It's all about controlling the narrative. Ilara would continue her meticulous count of medical supplies, her pen scratching methodically on the clipboard. "Indeed, Lieutenant." She'd murmur, her tone neutral, and he would preen, mistaking her bland acknowledgement for rapt agreement, and launch into another ill-digested paragraph from his latest doctrinal reading. She listened, though, cataloging the gaps in his understanding, the flawed assumptions, the dangerous overconfidence. It was, in its own way, a form of intelligence gathering. One sweltering afternoon, during a live-fire exercise for a new batch of infantry replacements, an exercise that had rapidly devolved into near chaos, the carefully constructed doubt surrounding Ilara began to fray at the edges for some. A target drone, crucial for qualifying a new sniper team being mentored by seasoned Special Forces NCOs, malfunctioned spectacularly. It veered sharply off its programmed course, its small engines sputtering erratically, heading directly towards the main ammunition storage area, a cluster of reinforced bunkers packed with enough ordnance to level a significant portion of the FOB. Panic erupted on the range. Radio channels crackled with conflicting orders, shouts, and curses. The drone's remote controls were unresponsive. The operator was frantically manipulating the joystick to no effect. Colonel Thorne, observing from the relative cool of the command tent set up near the firing line, swore, his face paling beneath his tan. The destruction of the ammo dump would be catastrophic, not just in terms of material loss, but in potential casualties. The snipers, elite as they were too far to get a clean shot at the rapidly moving, unpredictable target. Their angle was wrong, and the risk of a stray round hitting the bunkers was too high. Range safety officers were screaming into their radios, their voices tight with fear. Ilara had been near the vehicle maintenance bay, ostensibly checking inventory on spare tires for the base's aging fleet of utility vehicles. She saw the drone's erratic flight path, calculated its trajectory and declining airspeed with a speed and accuracy that would have astonished a seasoned air traffic controller. There was no time for protocol, no time to ask permission from men who were already losing control of the situation. She moved. Not with haste, which implied a lack of control, but with a terrifying, focused velocity. She vaulted into an unused light utility vehicle, the keys, as always, left in the ignition against regulations, a detail she had mentally filed away weeks ago during one of her quiet, methodical surveys of the base's operational readiness. The engine roared to life with a cough of diesel smoke. She didn't drive towards the drone. She drove to intercept its projected path, her hands sure and steady on the wheel, her eyes scanning the terrain, the wind direction indicated by the dust devils, the drone's faltering speed and altitude. She skidded the vehicle to a halt near a small, rocky outcrop that offered a slight elevation, leaped from the driver's seat while it was still rocking, and grabbed a heavy-duty nylon cargo strap from the flatbed. The drone, sputtering black smoke, was now dangerously low, almost grazing the tops of the thorny acacia bushes that dotted the arid landscape. As it wobbled past the outcrop, she moved like a whip unfurling, casting the strap with a practiced flick of her wrist, a technique honed not for cargo but for less conventional applications in other, darker places. The strap's heavy steel buckle snagged perfectly in the drone's undercarriage frame. Ilara braced herself, digging her heels into the loose scree, the nylon biting into her ungloved hands, using her body weight and leverage as an anchor. The drone, its forward momentum abruptly arrested, slammed into the dirt 20 yards shy of the first ammunition bunker, kicking up a plume of dust and debris. It was a wreck, its wings shattered, but it hadn't exploded, and the bunkers were safe. A profound silence descended, broken only by the crackle of a forgotten radio handset dropped in the panic and the distant, dying whine of the drone's wrecked engine. Then a babble of voices erupted as awareness returned. Colonel Thorne arrived in a heavily armed Humvee, which skidded to a stop beside her utility vehicle, his face a mask of disbelief, residual fear, and dawning fury. "Vance! What in the goddamn hell do you think you're doing?" he thundered, his voice cracking. "That was incredibly reckless. Irresponsible. You're a civilian. You could have been killed. You could have detonated the whole bloody dump." Ilara slowly, methodically recoiled the cargo strap, her knuckles scraped raw and already beginning to bleed. She looked at the colonel, her expression unreadable, her breathing barely elevated. "The drone was malfunctioning, sir," she stated, her voice calm, steady, carrying easily over the rising hubbub. It was heading for the ammunition storage. "There are procedures, Vance. Protocols. Designated personnel." He roared, though some of the initial heat had gone out of his voice, replaced by a grudging, uncomfortable awareness of what he had just witnessed. The sheer improbability of her action, its success, was warring with his ingrained adherence to order. "There wasn't time, Colonel," she replied simply, without a hint of defiance or apology. She held out the slightly frayed cargo strap. "This will need to be logged as damaged, and the vehicle will require a safety check." The young snipers who had run towards the scene, their rifles now lowered, stood staring, their usually stoic faces etched with astonishment. One of them, a staff sergeant whose helmet bore the grimly ironic name Havoc scrawled in faded marker, looked from the downed drone to Ilara, then back again. He'd seen operators move like that, with that kind of instinct and precision, but they wore multicam and carried a different kind of authority, not faded civilian coveralls. Private Miller, who had been tasked with delivering yet another round of water to the thirsty range personnel, watched from a distance, his mouth agape, the water canister forgotten at his feet. He saw not Miss Vance the supply clerk, but something else. Something formidable and utterly composed in the face of chaos. The incident was officially recorded as a lucky, if dangerously reckless, intervention by a civilian employee. Colonel Thorne gave Ilara a stern, formal warning in his office, his words meticulously chosen from the Manual on Civilian Contractor Conduct, about adhering to safety protocols and staying strictly within her designated role. But his eyes held a new uncertainty when he looked at her, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. He couldn't quite dismiss the image of her, standing firm against the drone's momentum, a solitary, determined figure against a backdrop of potential disaster. The word luck felt woefully, insultingly insufficient. He found himself replaying the scene in his mind, the impossible precision of her throw, the way she had braced herself. It wasn't luck. It was skill. A terrifying level of skill. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around Ilara subtly, yet undeniably, shifted. The blatant dismissiveness from some of the younger officers lessened, replaced by a wary curiosity, a hesitant respect they couldn't quite articulate. Lieutenant Henderson still pontificated, but he no longer directed his monologues solely at her. He seemed vaguely, uncomfortably aware that she might actually be listening and understanding on a level he couldn't begin to fathom. He even, on one occasion, found himself asking her opinion on a logistical snag, phrasing it awkwardly as, "Hypothetically, ma'am, if one were faced with such a supply chain disruption?" The low-ranking soldiers like Miller and Corporal Havoc's sniper team treated her with a quiet deference that bordered on reverence. They'd find reasons to pass by the supply depot, to offer a gruff, "Mornin', ma'am," or "Afternoon, Miss Vance," their eyes holding a question they didn't dare ask, a silent acknowledgement of something extraordinary. Rivas, the comm sergeant, once found her quietly recalibrating a sensitive piece of diagnostic equipment in the depot workshop, a tool his own team had been struggling with for days, unable to isolate a persistent ghost signal. He'd started to object, to assert his section's authority over such specialized gear, then stopped, remembering the Series B inverter and the calm certainty in her voice. He watched her for a moment, her touch deft and sure, her concentration absolute. When she finished and handed it back, perfectly tuned, the ghost signal gone, he just mumbled, "Thanks, ma'am." "Appreciate it." She just nodded, already turning her attention to a problematic fuel injector from one of the Humvees. One cool evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the desert horizon, a convoy rumbled through Fob's Scimitar, a temporary logistics stopover for a Special Forces unit rotating out of a long, arduous, deep reconnaissance mission in the hostile Northern Territories. Ilara was securing the main supply depot for the night, checking locks and alarms with her usual thoroughness, when a figure detached itself from a group of weary, dust-covered soldiers gathered near the mess hall, their gear piled haphazardly around them. He was older, a master sergeant, his face a roadmap of hard campaigns and too little sleep, his eyes carrying the familiar, soul-deep weariness of the truly experienced. He walked towards her, his limp almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but one she recognized, the result of an old wound, poorly healed in a place where proper medical care was a luxury. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering for a pregnant moment on her covered left wrist. His eyes, sharp and intelligent despite the fatigue, narrowed slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low gravel, rough from dust and disuse. Then, softer, almost a breath, a name spoken like a half-forgotten prayer. "Lark, is that you?" Ilara's posture didn't change. Her hands remained steady on the padlock she was securing, but something flickered deep in her eyes, a spark of recognition, a shadow of a shared, brutal past. She met his gaze, the years falling away for an instant. "Master Sergeant," she acknowledged, her tone even, betraying nothing to any casual listener. "Long time." "Damn long time," he agreed, a small, tired smile touching his lips, crinkling the sun-baked skin around his eyes. "Heard you'd retired, gone quiet, vanished." "Something like that," she said, her voice noncommittal. The quiet life appealed. He looked around the dusty, utilitarian expanse of the FOB, at the shipping containers and the razor wire. "This is quiet, I guess?" For some definitions of the word. His eyes came back to hers, a deep well of understanding in them, a shared lexicon of hardship and survival. "They treating you right here?" "I manage," Ilara said, the corner of her mouth twitching upwards almost imperceptibly. The Master Sergeant nodded slowly, a knowing look in his eyes. "You always did." He glanced back at his men, who were beginning to stir, ready to move on. "Good to see you, Lark. Stay safe out here." "You too, Gunny," she replied, using an old, familiar term of respect, from a different life, a different world. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. A silent salute between equals from a fraternity unseen by those around them, then turned and limped back to his unit, blending back into the anonymous ranks of soldiers. No one else had noticed the exchange, the quiet intensity of it, the weight of unspoken history that passed between them. But for Ilara, it was a reminder. The world was small. Echoes always returned, no matter how deep you buried the past. Colonel Thorne, meanwhile, his unease growing with each passing day, had requested Ilara Vance's full personnel file from Central Command. It arrived via secure courier, a surprisingly thin folder for someone of her apparent age and capability. Ilara Vance, former mid-level logistics consultant for a civilian contractor, Omni Solutions Group, that had done some peripheral work for the Department of Defense years ago. References were impeccable but vague, full Offadine phrases like highly reliable and possesses strong problem-solving skills. No family listed. No commendations, no disciplinary actions noted. It was the file of a ghost, a carefully constructed placeholder, offering plausible deniability. It didn't explain the way she moved with the deadly grace of a panther, the way she assessed a crisis with cold, logical precision, the almost preternatural calm she exuded under extreme pressure. It certainly didn't explain the drone incident in any satisfactory way. Thorne felt a growing sense of frustration, a conviction that he was missing a very large, very important piece of a complex puzzle. He started observing her more directly, though he tried to be discreet, not wanting to alert her or arouse suspicion among his staff. He saw the way she anticipated needs in the supply chain before they were officially voiced, the way she conserved every motion, every word, the way her eyes, when she thought no one was watching, scanned the perimeter fence line and the distant horizon with an unnerving professional intensity. He saw the quiet, unforced respect she received from the enlisted men, the ones who did the hard work, the ones who lived and died by competence, not by rank. They trusted her, in a way they didn't always trust their officers. The pressure point, when it came, was not a sudden explosion or a frontal assault, but a slow, suffocating squeeze of impending crisis. A critical intelligence report, passed down through encrypted channels from regional command, indicated a high probability of a sophisticated infiltration attempt on FOB's Scimitar. Not by local insurgents, whose tactics were predictable and relatively crude, but by a Tier 1 hostile state actor, aiming to retrieve or destroy highly sensitive material that had recently, and very discreetly, been moved to the base's newly constructed secure vault, material Thorne himself had overseen the clandestine arrival of just days before, its true nature known only to him and a handful of others at the highest levels. The base went on immediate high alert. Perimeter patrols were doubled, their routes randomized. Quick reaction forces were placed on standby, their vehicles fueled and armed. But the reports stressed the attackers would be elite, masters of stealth, sabotage, and deception. They wouldn't come blundering through the wire. They'd already be inside, or come in a way no one expected, perhaps disguised as friendly forces or exploiting an unforeseen vulnerability. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of Thorne's carefully maintained composure. His officers were good, well trained for conventional threats, for ambushes and IEDs. This was something else entirely, something from the shadowy world of espionage and special operations. He called an emergency briefing in the cramped confines of the Tactical Operations Center with his senior staff and section heads. The mood was grim, the air thick with tension and stale coffee. Lieutenant Henderson, ever confident, offered a complex plan involving concentric rings of defense, layered sensor grids, and roving patrols, quoting extensively from a field manual on base defense that Thorne knew he'd probably skimmed that morning. Captain Davies, usually steady and unflappable, looked pale and worried, his eyes darting to the secure communications console. The comms lines to Regional Command were saturated, offering little immediate support beyond terse injunctions to maintain vigilance and report any anomalies. They were, essentially, on their own. As the briefing wore on, a nervous young corporal slipped in and handed Colonel Thorne a note, scribbled hastily on a signal pad. "Sir, General Wyatt is en route. Unscheduled. ETA 15 minutes. Call sign Olympus Actual. Black Hawk." Thorne frowned, his mind racing. General Thaddeus Wyatt was 3 rungs above him in the chain of command, a legendary, almost mythical figure from Special Operations Command, renowned for his unconventional thinking and his involvement in some of his most sensitive and dangerous operations. What was he doing here, unannounced, descending on a relatively minor FOB in the middle of a high-threat alert? "Understood," Thorne said, tucking the note into his pocket, his sense of unease deepening. The immediate problem remained: how to defend against ghosts. He was about to dismiss the meeting, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest, his mind already cycling through worst-case scenarios, when he saw Elara Vance outside the open door of the operations center, speaking quietly with Private Miller. Miller was gesturing animatedly towards the northern perimeter, his young face earnest and concerned. Elara was listening intently, her head tilted slightly, her expression thoughtful. An idea, desperate and utterly unorthodox, sparked in Thorne's mind. He remembered the drone, the calm voice suggesting a fix for the encrypted comms, the almost invisible nod of recognition from the grizzled Special Forces Master Sergeant. He remembered the file that told him nothing, and the woman who told him even less, but showed him so much. "Vance," he called out, his voice sharper, more abrupt than he intended, cutting through the low murmur of conversation in the TOC. Elara turned, her expression neutral, unchanging. She excused herself from Private Miller, who looked startled by the colonel's summons, and walked towards the tent. "Colonel?" she inquired, her voice calm. The officers inside stared, their conversations ceasing abruptly. What did the colonel want with the supply clerk at a time like this? Was he going to ask her to inventory sandbags? "Miss Vance," Thorne began, then hesitated. The Ms. felt absurdly, offensively inadequate, given the precipice they stood upon. "The intelligence we have suggests a highly specialized threat. Intruders who will be difficult to detect, let alone counter." He watched her face closely, searching for any reaction, any flicker of surprise or fear. There was none, just calm, unwavering attention. "Your insights have been noted in the past. Your observations," he stumbled over the words, feeling the inadequacy of his own language. "Do you have any thoughts on vulnerabilities? Areas where conventional security might be insufficient for this type of adversary?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Lieutenant Henderson scoffed quietly, an involuntary sound of disbelief, then fell silent under Thorne's sudden, icy glare. Ilara's gaze swept slowly around the faces in the tent, taking in the anxiety, the uncertainty. Then her eyes seemed to look past them, through the canvas walls, assessing the layout of the base, the blind spots, the routines, the very pulse of the place, with an almost palpable intensity. "They won't use the main access points or try to cut the wire," she said, her voice low and even, yet carrying an inherent authority that commanded attention. "Too predictable. Too many layers of observation. They'll look for utility conduits, drainage systems, anything that bypasses standard checkpoints and sensor grids. They'll use the deepest part of the night, or create a significant diversion to draw your QRF away from the true point of entry. They'll know your patrol patterns, your guard shift changes, your sensor dead zones, your communication protocols. They'll likely already have assets inside. Sleepers, compromised local nationals, or even one of your own personnel turned or blackmailed. Or they will have conducted extensive prior reconnaissance, possibly for weeks. Each sentence was a flat statement of fact, delivered without inflection, yet carrying the chilling weight of absolute certainty, as if she were reading from a familiar script. Henderson started to speak, a flush rising on his neck. "With all due respect, ma'am, that's pure speculation. We have robust security measures." "She's right," Captain Davies interrupted, his voice hushed, his eyes fixed on Ilara with a new dawning comprehension. He was remembering the comms failure, her instant diagnosis. "That's exactly how we'd do it if we were on the other side. That's textbook unconventional infiltration." Thorne felt a cold chill trace its way down his spine. Ilara continued, her gaze now fixed on the large tactical map of the FOB pinned to a board. "Your primary weak points are the northern perimeter near the old wadi. Ground surveillance radar has a known blind spot there due to the terrain contours. And the thermal imagers are less effective against someone using advanced countermeasures. And the civilian contractor block. Transient personnel, less stringent background checks, easier to insert an operative among them." She paused, her finger lightly touching a point on the map indicating the secure vault. "The vault itself, is it new construction? Retrofitted from an existing structure? What are the adjoining structures? Utility access points? Air vents? Power conduits? Data lines?" Thorne, stunned by her precise, professional, and terrifyingly accurate assessment, found himself answering her questions as if she were the one in command. "New construction. Heavily reinforced concrete. Seismic sensors. Blast-proof doors. Standalone structure with a clear 50-meter perimeter." Ilara nodded slowly, processing the information. "Good. But access is still key. Maintenance shafts for the climate control? HVAC systems? Who had access to the final blueprints and construction details? Who supervised the civilian contractors who built it?" The questions were relentless, surgical, cutting through layers of assumed security like a scalpel. She wasn't speculating. She was dissecting their defenses with the cold precision of an expert. The authority in her voice was undeniable, born not of rank or position, but of deep, visceral, hard-won knowledge. The officers in the TOC were silent now, listening intently, their earlier skepticism replaced by a mixture of shock and dawning respect. Even Lieutenant Henderson looked uneasy, his youthful arrogance visibly deflated, replaced by a dawning awareness that he was profoundly, dangerously out of his depth. Suddenly, the unmistakable rhythmic whump-whump-whump of a Black Hawk helicopter grew louder, approaching fast from the east. It wasn't the standard Medevic bird or the dusty logistics transport they were used to. This one had a deeper, more aggressive thrum to its rotors, a sound that spoke of power and specialized purpose. Heads turned towards the sound. "That'll be General Wyatt," Thorne said, his voice tight, a sense of foreboding mixing with a strange, unwelcome flicker of something else. Hope? Relief that someone else was about to share this crushing burden? The Black Hawk, matte black and bristling with specialized antenna and sensor pods, didn't bother with the main helipad. It swept in low and fast over the perimeter fence, executing a perfect, dust-scattering flare to touch down directly in front of the command tent, its powerful rotor wash blasting sand and grit everywhere, forcing the assembled officers to shield their eyes and turn away. The side door slid open with a pneumatic hiss before the rotors had even begun to slow their lethal spin. Two figures emerged, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. The first was indeed General Wyatt, his 3 stars glinting on his collar, his face set in grim lines, his uniform immaculate despite the sudden and dramatic arrival. The second was a younger man, lean and hard-eyed, wearing sterile, unmarked black fatigues with no insignia, carrying a hardened metallic briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. Wyatt strode directly towards Colonel Thorne, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers, then pausing, almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing slightly, when he saw Ilara standing quietly to one side, untouched by the surrounding flurry. "Colonel Thorne," Wyatt said, his voice a low command that cut through the noise of the still whirring rotors. "We have a critical situation. I need to speak with one of your personnel, urgently." "General," Thorne replied, snapping to a somewhat ragged attention, still blinking dust from his eyes.
Of course. Anything you need. Who do you need?
He expected Wyatt to name one of his section heads, perhaps his intelligence officer, or the commander of the QRF. Wyatt's gaze, however, did not land on any of Thorne's uniformed staff. It fixed directly, unequivocally, on Elara. I need Operative Nightshade. A stunned, absolute silence fell over the group, so profound that the only sound was the slowing whine of the Black Hawk's turbines. Operative Nightshade? The name meant nothing to anyone there. It sounded like something out of a spy novel. Thorne frowned in utter confusion, his mind blank. Sir? I don't believe we have anyone by that designation on this base. Perhaps there's been a mistake in the manifest? The general's gaze did not waver from Elara. The hard-eyed man beside him, still holding the briefcase, also turned his unwavering attention to her. There was a look of grim recognition in his eyes. Elara met Wyatt's look. For the first time since she had arrived at FOB Scimitar months ago, a subtle but profound shift occurred in her demeanor. It wasn't dramatic, not a sudden unmasking, but the air around her seemed to solidify, her stillness taking on a new, potent, and dangerous quality. The civilian cloak, so carefully, so patiently maintained, was beginning to fall away, revealing the formidable structure beneath. It's an old call sign, General, Elara said, her voice still quiet, but now resonating with an undeniable authority, a resonance that silenced every other sound and thought. I answer to Elara Vance now, most of the time. General Wyatt allowed himself a brief, grim smile, a fleeting expression that did little to lighten the severity of his face. Not anymore, Elara. Not today. He turned to a visibly bewildered Colonel Thorne, his expression brooking no argument, no questions. Colonel, Ms. Vance is being reactivated, effective immediately. By direct order of the Secretary of Defense, under National Security Directive 734, he nodded curtly to the man beside him, who stepped forward, unlocked the handcuff, and opened the briefcase. Inside, nestled on dark, precisely cut foam, was a single, sealed manila envelope, heavily stamped with the highest security classifications Thorne had ever seen, markings that made his blood run cold. The man handed the envelope directly to Elara. Elara took the envelope, her fingers, still faintly stained with the day's grease from nursing Generator 3 back to health, brushed against the pristine official paper. She didn't open it immediately. Her eyes, calm and assessing, met Thorne's. His face was a study in profound shock, escalating disbelief, and a rapidly dawning, deeply uncomfortable understanding. The quiet supply clerk, the civilian, the woman he'd warned about overstepping her bounds. Vance, Thorne managed, his voice barely a whisper, his throat suddenly dry. The other officers were frozen, staring as if she had suddenly sprouted wings. Lieutenant Henderson looked like he'd seen a particularly malevolent ghost from one of his textbooks come to life. Private Miller, who had crept closer, drawn by the undeniable drama of the Black Hawk's arrival and the presence of a 3-star general, watched with wide, uncomprehending, almost fearful eyes. Elara's gaze was steady, holding his. Yes, Colonel? You're... He couldn't finish the sentence. The pieces were slotting into place with the sickening, irreversible speed of a collapsing building. The drone, the comms, fix. The way she moved, thought, anticipated, the almost surgical precision of her security assessment just moments before, the brief, intense encounter with the visiting Master Sergeant. It all coalesced into a picture so startling, so far beyond his comprehension, that his mind struggled to accept it. General Wyatt cut in, his tone sharp and urgent, leaving no room for further stunned silence. There's no time for explanations or recriminations, Thorne. Nightshade is the only one who can handle this. She knows the enemy's playbook because she helped write significant parts of it. He looked back at Elara, a new intensity in his eyes. The sensitive material in your vault? It's bait. High value, but still bait. The real target is here. He tapped the now empty briefcase the other man still held, which presumably had contained more than just her orders. And they know it's here. Or they will very soon. Elara nodded slowly, her mind already processing the new intelligence, calculating probabilities, assessing threats. She finally looked down at the envelope in her hands. With a steady, deliberate movement, she broke the heavy seals. Her eyes scanned the contents quickly, her expression unchanging, her focus absolute. When she looked up, the transformation was complete. The quiet, unassuming civilian, Alara Vance, was gone. In her place stood someone else. Someone whose presence filled the space around the command tent, whose eyes held the chilling focus of a predator that has just picked up the scent of its prey. The lines of experience around her eyes now looked less like the gentle marks of age and more like the intricate, hard-won map of 1,000 dangerous journeys through the darkest corners of the world. Even the ill-fitting, grease-stained civilian coveralls seemed to hang differently on her, as if her very frame had subtly realigned, her posture infused with a lethal grace. I'll need unrestricted access to the vault's complete architectural and electronic schematics, full perimeter sensor logs and CCTV footage for the last 72 hours, and a dedicated, encrypted comms line with direct burst capability to Olympus Actual, she said, her voice crisp, devoid of any previous deference or humility. It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to instant obedience in matters of life and death. Colonel Thorne, still reeling from the succession of shocks, could only nod, his authority on his own base suddenly, completely superseded. Of course, anything you need. Anything at all. He turned to his stunned staff, his voice regaining some of its command. You heard her. Get her what she needs. Now. Move. The officers, galvanized by the palpable urgency and the sheer, unbelievable reality of the situation unfolding before them, scrambled to comply. Captain Davies, his face a mixture of awe and trepidation, rushed to the comms tent to secure the encrypted line. Lieutenant Henderson, pale and silent, his earlier arrogance completely extinguished, hurried to find the vault schematics, looking as if he might be sick. Ilara looked at General Wyatt. My gear? Wyatt gestured with a curt nod towards the waiting Black Hawk. On board, everything you specified in Protocol Labyrinth, last updated 6 months ago. She nodded once. A sharp, precise movement. Protocol Labyrinth. A deep cover contingency plan, so secret, so compartmented, that even Thorne, with his top-secret clearance, had never heard of it. She turned to leave, then paused, her eyes finding Private Miller, who was still standing by the edge of the organized chaos, looking utterly bewildered but also with a dawning, almost worshipful awe in his young eyes. Ilara offered him the slightest of nods, a flicker of acknowledgement, almost a ghost of a smile that made the young soldier stand a little straighter, a flush rising on his cheeks. As she walked towards the waiting Black Hawk, her stride was purposeful, economical, each step conveying a lethal efficiency. The powerful downdraft from the still-turning rotors whipped at her unbound hair and pressed her coveralls against her body, but she didn't flinch, didn't break stride. The hard-eyed man from Wyatt's team, whose name, she recalled, was Casey and whose call sign was Wraith, fell into step beside her, speaking in low, urgent tones, presumably updating her on tactical specifics not included in the written orders. Before she reached the aircraft, she paused for a fleeting moment and unstrapped her simple, utilitarian watch. For a brief second, as she transferred it to her pocket, the faded blue-black image of the nightingale, wings spread in silent, eternal flight, was visible on the skin of her inner wrist. Then she slipped the watch into her pocket, and without a single backward glance at the life she was leaving behind or the stunned men she was leaving it with, she stepped up and into the shadowy interior of the helicopter. Colonel Thorne watched her go, the discarded, now utterly irrelevant civilian personnel file for Alara Vance feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He looked at General Wyatt, his mind still struggling to reconcile the woman who fixed his generators with the operative stepping into that menacing black aircraft. Sir, who is she? What is she? Wyatt's expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the Black Hawk as its engine spooled up to full power. She's the one you call when there's no one else left to call, Colonel. She's the one who walks willingly into the deepest dark so that others can stay in the light, or at least what passes for it. He glanced at the sky, where the Black Hawk was already lifting off, its black silhouette shrinking rapidly against the harsh, unforgiving desert sun. Pray she's in time, for all our sakes. The dust began to settle, literally and figuratively, over Fob Scimitar. The remaining officers stood in a stunned, silent huddle, their previous certainties, their understanding of their own small world, shattered. Lieutenant Henderson was visibly shaken, his textbook theories and neatly ordered doctrines suddenly feeling like children's stories in the face of this raw, elemental reality. Captain Davies looked towards the departing helicopter with a newfound, profound respect, a respect tinged with a deep sense of shame for his earlier blindness. He remembered her quiet words, her unerring instincts, her unassuming presence. He understood now. He understood the grease stains on her hands, the watchful stillness in her eyes. Private Miller approached Colonel Thorne hesitantly, his voice barely audible above the fading sound of the helicopter.
Sir, Miss Vance, her, was she always?
Thorne looked down at the young soldier. He saw the confusion, the fear, but also the undiluted, uncomplicated admiration. He thought of all the times he had dismissed her, patronized her, confined her to a neat, easily managed box labeled civilian. He felt a profound flush of shame, quickly suppressed, but deeply felt.
She's more than we knew, Private,
Thorne said, his voice hoarse. Much, much more. Inside the Black Hawk, as it banked sharply and accelerated towards an unknown confrontation, Alara was already shedding the last vestiges of Alara Vance. The man called Wraith, Casey, laid out a set of lightweight, advanced body armor and an array of sophisticated equipment that bore no resemblance to standard military issue. Her movements were swift, practiced, economical as she donned the gear. It fit like a second skin, familiar and reassuring. She checked the custom integrally suppressed sidearm, the array of specialized non-lethal and lethal tools, the encrypted comms unit that linked her directly to a very select, very secure network. Casey watched her, his expression one of quiet, professional respect. They had worked together before, years ago, on an operation in a frozen wasteland that neither of them ever spoke about, an operation that had forged a bond of unbreakable trust. "Target profile update?" Alara asked, her voice calm, devoid of emotion, as she chambered a round into her primary weapon, a compact, highly modified carbine. "Special Group Kestrel," Casey replied, his own voice a low monotone. "Their best. Premier Psychological Warfare and Wet Work Unit. Believed to be led by a ghost operative codenamed Viper. Intel suggests they think they're here for the asset in Wyatt's briefcase, the one containing the compromised decryption keys. They don't know the asset is you. They don't know you've been activated." Ilara's lips curved into a smile that was not entirely pleasant, a dangerous, predatory baring of teeth. "Then let's re-educate them," she said softly. The Nightingale was ready to fly. The call sign Lark had been for a younger, perhaps more innocent operative, one who still believed in clear distinctions between right and wrong. Nightshade was for the one who dealt with the deadliest poisons, the most insidious threats, and sometimes for the one who had to become the greater darkness to fight what lurked in the shadows. Back on the ground, Colonel Thorne stood for a long time, long after the sound of the Black Hawk had faded into the vast indifference of the desert sky. He stared at the empty space where it had been, the orders from the Secretary of Defense still clutched in his hand, orders that had arrived in a storm of dust and revelation, bearing her true name, a name that echoed with the silent thunder of a hidden, unending war. He looked down at the now redundant personnel file, its bland pronouncements a mockery of the woman he had so spectacularly misjudged. He finally understood the tension she had always seemed to register in the air, a tension he was only now, belatedly, beginning to feel himself. The world, he realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, was far more dangerous, and far more heroically, silently protected than he had ever truly known. And the quietest people, the ones who moved unseen and unheard through the background of louder lives, often carried the heaviest burdens and harbored the greatest, most fiercely guarded strengths. He finally lowered his gaze, a new, profound respect dawning in his eyes, not just for the legendary operative known as Nightshade, but for the unassuming woman who had patiently, stoically endured their ignorance, their arrogance, their blindness. He hoped, with a fervor that surprised him with its intensity, that she would succeed. The silence she left behind was more profound, more charged with unspoken meaning, than any noise the base could ever make. Someone, perhaps Captain Davies, took a hesitant step towards him, as if to speak, but Thorne simply raised a hand, needing the quiet to absorb the enormity of what had just transpired. The dust had settled, but nothing on FOB Scimitar would ever be quite the same.